On Make Better Wealth Decisions, we're speaking to one of the top trade lawyers in North America, and he's got some great insights as to how this trade dispute might play out and what it means for you in your portfolio. You won't want to miss this. This is Make Better Wealth Decisions, a podcast about financial blind spots, decision making, and how the reality of higher rates, global tensions, and tariff instability impact your investments. I'm your host, John DeGuy, a portfolio manager with Design Securities in Toronto. This week on Make Better Wealth Decisions, we are speaking with Barry Appleton. Barry is the co-director and distinguished senior fellow at the Center for International Law at New York Law School, where he also serves as a distinguished adjunct professor. He's a highly recognized international lawyer specializing in international trade and investment laws. He's the managing partner of Appleton and Associates International Law LLP, where he provides strategic counsel on complex cross-border disputes. And there is more. He is also consistently ranked as a top global practitioner in investment treaty arbitration. Professor Appleton has advised governments at various levels in international economic legal policy, treaty negotiations, and dispute resolutions. Barry, how are you?
I'm wonderful. I'm so happy to join you and all of your viewers for the little chat today.
And I cannot help but notice that for the sake of my viewers at home listening, that was a really truncated introduction for Barry. I could have gone on for 5 minutes, but then we wouldn't have any time to actually ask him any questions. So Barry's a real star in the international trade and tariff world. And of course, tariffs are on everyone's mind with the new tariffs going into effect in Canada and really across most of the world on April 2nd. So that, of course, is where I want to start with you. I'm wondering if you could set the table for us. What should we be expecting? Where does Canada fit in relative to other countries in the world? What's the motivation behind this? All of that.
Okay. I'm glad you asked me something nice and simple. Look, let's start through because everybody wants to know what the hell's going on. So let's first of all let's just go back a couple of weeks. So March the 4th is a day where the US starts to impose a series of tariffs on Canada. Now we have a trade agreement. We originally had the NAFTA, then we have its replacement, the USMCA. And under that trade agreement, there should be no ability to impose these types of tariffs. But the US declared an emergency. They said the emergency was on the basis of fentanyl coming across the border. And in a very unusual situation that we've never seen before, they linked the fentanyl to tariffs and imposed tariffs on Canada. So these were imposed on March the 4th, 25%, 10% on energy, 25% on everything else. And then, as I'm sure all your viewers know, they were pulled back 2 days later on the 6th. But then a week later on the 12th, the US imposes very significant tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. And these are 25% tariffs, they're global tariffs. And so we knew that this was for real. This wasn't being pulled back. And the Americans said, look, we'll hold off until we're going to deal with a variety of countries. We're going to deal with all of that on the 2nd of April. And that day, which they now are calling Trade Liberation Day. Okay. So the 2nd of April is the key date. And on that day, they picked a large number of countries. I've given testimony to the U.S. Trade Representative's office recently on this. They were interested in 20 countries. They've selected some 15 of them. They call them the Dirty 15. And yes, Canada's part of the Dirty 15. It's a little bit like the Dirty Dozen plus 3. And the 3, by the way, seem to be Canada, Mexico, and China. So that's the Dirty Dozen plus 3. And so they are definitely imposing tariffs on that day. So on that day, the Americans say that they're going to impose a number. We don't know what that number is. My guess it's going to be 20, maybe 25%. And that's going to be on everything. Plus, on top of that, they're going to also add some additional things. For example, the US has decided that value-added taxes like Canada's GST, they've decided that is something they're going to tariff separately. So in their mind, if you export your goods and you have applied as a matter of your taxation policy, a GST or an HST, they say that artificially depresses the value of the goods for the basis of the tariff. So they're going to increase the tariff to deal with that. So basically, easiest way to understand that is that if I sell something for $100 in Canada, I'm going to remove, let's say it's from Ontario, I'm going to remove $13 of that. So the basis for the tariff is going to be $87. If it's from America, since they don't have a value added tax and it's $100, it's $100. So the tariff is on a higher amount. They say that's unfair. They're going to do that not just to Canada, they're going to do it to Europe because they're going to post them. They're definitely in the dirty 15. And so you're going to see they have VAT rates on average 20 to 23%, sometimes as high as 28%. So in addition to your tariff, you're also going to have this VAT issue. And then there may be something else. If there's something they don't like right now, Canada has a digital sales tax. Digital services tax, DST. You may add something in there. So you add these all together and you're going to get a number. Canada's number is going to be big. Now, the idea of this number is to be in terror. They want to terrorize you to start negotiating to get that number down. Some countries have already started making deals with the United States. India's in meetings right now. They're going to do everything they can to get it so that they have very small amount or no tariff. The UK have done a charm offensive, and they brought that beautiful letter from King Charles. Seems to say the UK. I'm hoping maybe he'll do something to save Canada, and they're likely to also have no tariffs. But we don't know. Everybody doesn't know until next week. But on Trade Liberation Day, markets are really going to be moving because markets don't like a lack of certainty and a lack of predictability for sure. And there's going to be a lot of dislocation. So that's the state of play. That's where we're at. Do you want to talk about the why or do you want to talk about the what? We got so many places we can go here.
Let's talk about, because that was a great introduction to what's going on around the world. I wouldn't mind taking a moment because I heard you give a great talk just very recently about a number of related things. And one of them was the special relationship that up until very recently existed between Canada and the US. And I think you once referred to it as the special relationship that wasn't. What exactly are these tariffs doing to the relationship between Canada and the US? And what do you think that means for trade policy and economics going forward?
Okay. First of all, Canada discovered on March the 4th that it wasn't a family. It was a target. Okay. For Canadians, that was pretty tough. We see the Americans as our allies. They're our natural market. They are who we deal with all the time. Our economy for the last 70 years has been integrated deeply, and we have complex supply chains. So we just simply assumed that was going to continue. That world's over. Okay. Whether we like it or not, the world has changed profoundly in that way. And so that requires Canada to really think about things differently. But our problem is that we weren't ready. We weren't ready with the type of robust national policies that we would need to do. Parliament didn't pass the types of things that we would want to do to be able to get there. So we're basically have a situation where we have one customer for between 75 and 83% of our goods. What happens when that customer goes? What happens when that customer changes where it's going to be? They impose tariffs on our products and our products are more expensive. Now, does that do something better for America? Do you put more tax on them? No, it does nothing for us. But we have very serious dislocations and they're going to be starting right away. We've already seen it in the auto sector. So that's a very big issue for Southwestern Ontario. Auto parts and automobiles are very significant for Ontario and also for part of Quebec. Those are going to be very hard to deal with. But we have other issues too. And so we're going to have to work our way through this because foundationally, this is not just a market moving event, but it's a national existential crisis in Canada. It's changed the national tenor. It's changed the national debate. And it's in many ways forcing Canada to grow up. And it means that Canada's going to have to make a series of difficult choices that we didn't really want to make. But Joan, I wrote a book about the NAFTA over 30 years ago. And there were a number of issues that were in that book, a book called Navigating NAFTA, that foundationally haven't changed in the last 30 years. They deal with how the banking system works. And there are real barriers for American banks to do full branch banking. Yes, they can operate a bank in Canada, but the minimum deposit that they can take at any given time or transaction is $150,000. I'm not giving any kid $150,000 for allowance. That's what you would need to do to be able to bank with an American bank in Canada. So obviously, that takes you out of the retail sector. It was a non-tariff barrier, and the Americans have made it very clear they want to get that fixed. And to be honest, they're probably right. Probably better for Canadians to have more competition anyways. Same thing's going to be on supply management, probably another area. So I call it that there's the crown jewels and the trophies. And for sure, the Americans have a list of crown jewels and trophies they want in different countries. They've already been communicating that. But our big issue is Canada has to decide what type of costs are we prepared to take to be able to retain resilience and robustness ourselves. And that's going to require a lot of public policy changes and a pile of other changes. Maybe later in this conversation, we'll get there, but that's where we're at.
Okay, so one of the things that you mentioned in your talk, and it's funny because I just recently wrote a piece called "Gangster in the White House," talking about how Trump's negotiations are really just shakedowns. And the terminology that you used was the rule of law versus the rule of whim. And the thing that I think we agree on is that conventions, norms, including laws such as CUSMA, we call it CUSMA in Canada, you would call it USMCA in the US, but at any rate, the trade deal between the three major countries in North America is something that was basically ripped asunder, not because of anything to do with the agreements that were reached 8 or 10 years ago, but because because a president made a trumped up charge with regard to fentanyl and then used that as an excuse to basically disregard the entire agreement. So the question that I think a lot of people have on their mind is, to what extent would if I heard you correctly with regard to what the Brits are doing, it's almost like they're using a Neville Chamberlain approach to how to negotiate with this guy. And do you even attempt to negotiate? Because what he's doing is really not a negotiation whatsoever. He's torn asunder the actual mechanisms for negotiation and said, this is how it's going to be. And used completely spurious reasoning for it. But the fact of the matter is, realpolitik, we all have to deal with it. So how should countries be dealing with this?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack. So let's see if we can start there. First of all, you're right. Canada calls it the CUSMA. I actually called it the USHMACA, which is
Okay.
its name. But at the end of the day, whether you've got it or not, what you really now know is that the treaty is no longer worth the paper it was written on. When you have a treaty that isn't being followed, you have to know that's a problem. And we also know that the emergency powers that are being applied by the US government right now are basically duct tape. They've been hastily applied. They're not really a real thing. They're questionable ties to national security. This is legal sleight of hand. Okay. And it doesn't just apply to the USMCA, but it applies to global norms across the board. So what I think would really be helpful is I want to situate what's really going on with these crises first, and then we'll talk about the way to fix them. And I call it a polycrisis. It's a 5 alarm fire. There's 5 different things that are going on. Once we understand and break down the 5, it's going to help us to figure out what Canada needs to do, because you might just be reacting to one part of the fire, but another part is going to go out of control and you can't deal with it. So let me just lay it out for you. Okay. The first part is, clearly we see from the tariffs, we have trade fragmentation. Okay. The global supply chain is splintering into trade blocks right now. There's no predictable rules-based system, so the markets are reacting very negatively to that. So sectors that are very reliant on cross-border inputs, autos, electronics, they are all facing delays, cost increases, and problems that we can't even anticipate because until they work their way through. Okay, so that's the first piece. Second piece, we have deep security erosion. And by that, geopolitical security erosion.
Yeah.
Long-standing alliances like NATO or NORAD are fraying under what I'll call transactional leadership from the United States. Canada can no longer assume that U.S. policy is going to reflect shared strategic goals. Same with our European friends. That has very significant implications in trade as well, and you can see in some other areas. The third is what's happening after trade. We're going to see a lot of rumblings, a lot of rumors that there's going to be a currency devaluation, real foundational currency disruption. There's sometimes it's being called the Mar-a-Lago dollar reset. It's that concept that because the tariffs are going and the defense costs are going to push these countries that have to pay more into having lower currencies because of that, like the Canadian dollar will go down because of what's exactly what's happening. That means Canadian goods are less expensive, which means that they are easier in terms of export. The Americans want to lower their dollar so they can export more. You have to do that with a currency disruption. They had a thing called the Plaza Accord. The Plaza Accord was an agreement of 5 countries. There's no way you're going to get an agreement to revalue the dollar. So instead, you got to push this. You're going to push this by a US-based devaluation, probably by using a number of different bond swapping tools, changing the durational aspects of bonds and moving that out, switching Canadian purchases of US treasuries for Canadian purchase, and a crypto back, stablecoin, something else that the administration's putting together. When you put these all together, what are you going to get? Deeply implied foreign exchange volatility, capital flight from the emerging markets for sure, and a higher risk premium globally. So that you're going to get currency devaluation, security erosion, trade fragmentation, and then you got 2 very serious issues of the new economy, the innovation. The first is digital sovereignty collapse. That governance in terms of global digital elements is breaking down. So instead of having common rules right now for data, for AI, and for digital services, countries are working on their own, and they're weaponizing them to make it less likely that you can get commerce rather than more. That's the problem. So if you're a Canadian innovator, for example, you have an uphill battle navigating these incompatible standards. You need compatible standards if you want to do business, but yet you're going to have to pick a block. And that's the last part, techno splintering. This AI race, the quantum computing issues, critical tech standards are going to divide everybody into Fortress North America, Fortress Asia, Fortress Europe. And so what does that mean? Higher R&D costs, very fragmented intellectual property protection, and a true balkanization of innovation. So when you have this polycrisis, you put that together, you have to think very carefully, how are you going to react as a country? Because what might work really well on trade might work really badly on currency and terribly about digital. So if you don't keep the 5 crises in mind, your investment decisions are going to get messed up and your policy decisions are going to get messed up. So you need to be, if you're dealing with this in government, you got to have composure. You got to play 3D chess and you can't play checkers. If you play checkers, you're going to lose. So that's really where we start all of this from.
Okay, so Gary, I want to see if I can get you to weigh in on something that is maybe a little bit beyond your normal purview, but you've used the word polycrisis 2 or 3 times now today. And one of your colleagues, I don't know if you know him, a guy by the name of Nouriel Roubini, wrote a book a couple of years ago called Mega Threats. And it is in this book that I first heard the phrase polycrisis. And he talks about many of the things that you're talking about, the threats of AI, but also climate change and demographic problems and debt levels that are both public and private. And do you believe that most investors, because this is called make better wealth decisions, so the people who are making wealth decisions, to what extent do you think ordinary retail investors are even mindful of the fact that we are pretty much already in a polycrisis and now it's just a question of navigation and muddling through?
Okay, first of all, traditionally, if you look at the work of economists like Daniel Kahneman, he'll tell you that we traditionally undervalue most risks. We overvalue a couple of risks, and then we undervalue the risks that we should be looking at. So for clearly, we're undervaluing a number of risks. But what Professor Roubini has talked about is what I call fat tails, low expectancy, high detrimental impact events. Okay. The problem that we have right now is that instead of having 1 of them or 2 of them, we have 5 of them. And
She says there's 10.
okay. And what's going on is the White House is inviting us to bring cans of gasoline to this party and light matches. So what you get from result of that is entropy. you find the wheels of the wagon start falling off in places you don't expect. All right. So that means that you have to anticipate more volatility in your markets. You need to think about what's the currency you're going to need to be able to deal with things. If the Canadian dollar might be going lower now, but might be going higher later, you've got to decide. Do I want to be in Canadian currency because I need Canadian currency because that's what my costs are? Do I want to be somewhere else completely? The US dollar, which for many people has been a safe haven for a very long time, may not be so safe if the Mar-a-Lago Accord goes ahead, right? It's going to cause a shift. So you need to think about your risk tolerance in a different way. And you need to think about these in different spots. And so for that, John, I actually have four sort of future scenarios, four type of ways you can think about the future. And then depending on what sort of meets with your own sense, your own risk tolerances and appetite, it may help you as to what's going on. Because we're all guessing as to how this is going to play out because it's unprecedented. We've never had this, so we can't even figure it out. So the first scenario I like to think about is I call it the outlaw and the orderly. So in this scenario, the US exits the rules-based trading order, but everybody else stays in and keeps the rules-based system. So Canada, the EU, even the Chinese, they like standards. They stay in and keep standards, but the US doesn't. It's a situation where you can invite everybody over for Thanksgiving, but this is like the crazy uncle. You have to invite the crazy uncle, but you ignore what the crazy uncle does. But it's hard to ignore a very rich crazy uncle when they happen to be an economic superpower. So what does that mean? It means that the global trade system bifurcates between the US and everybody else. The risk adjusted returns decline in US facing export sectors. That's what that means. So the Canadian dollar becomes more correlated to Asian and EU trade because you can't rely on US trade. So you have a divergence of regulatory frameworks and it changes supply chains. I'd suggest it fragments them and it very significantly increases compliance costs. So that's the first scenario. Okay. Your second scenario, I call it the bilateral bazaar. When anything's available for a price and trade is entirely transactional, deal by deal negotiation. So here you're constantly repricing cross-border risk because it's the crisis du jour. Whatever's going to happen, you're only as good as your next tweet. You don't know what's going to happen and you got to deal with it. So companies that have US exposure are facing constant negotiation, constant tariff volatility. Okay. So there, what becomes so important? Insurance, foreign exchange hedging strategies, and lobbying becomes part of your core business because you've got to lobby to make a better deal. You're constantly making a deal. So volatility now, rather than just being on the side, becomes your everyday thing. It becomes structural. Okay. And you've got to think a lot more about having domestic resilience in your own public policy. You got to look at what you're going to do for things. You need to have your own resilient agriculture and a technology and an infrastructure. So that's a different type of. A third world I call Fortress North America. Canada and Mexico and the US have a common high tariff block. Now that's going to be very difficult to make because there's going to be some growing pains. Okay. So capital rotation comes back to North America, but only to North America. So you get localized supply chains, a little bit like we had with NAFTA, but they come at a higher cost because you're not going to get consistent market access. You can always be raiding it from the Americans. So the tariff barriers raise consumer prices, but it may spur Canadian manufacturing, depending on where we are in that. Okay. That means that depending on where you are in the fortress, if you're inside or outside, so it may create import substitution, government-backed R&D that create more resilience. Sovereignty-themed funds may become very important. So you need to think about that. If that's where you think the world's going, that's where you might have to head. And then the last one I call global rules are reloaded. And that is there's a backlash. Countries, including Canada, double down on the rule of law, on the multilateral order. So in this view, in fact, eventually, everything returns to normal after a painful little couple of years. The WTO reform gains some momentum. Canada, again, follows standards and maybe sets them. There's more predictability. Investor confidence improves. So this is, though, a long game, not a short game. We go back to looking at ESG as maybe something as important. Institutional capital, pension funds may lead the change along the way, and they may lead the charge of what we were going to do to find what's trustworthy. But in these four different worlds, you've got to decide. And right now in a polycrisis, you don't know where to go. So you really need to figure out as much as possible. You go back, fixed income looks so much better now than it did a couple of months ago. And maybe you're thinking about other things as well. Keep value. It's just a difficult time, but the world is going to have more volatility, not less. And the world is not going to see more globalization. It's going to see less. So you need to think about these impacts as we go ahead, because that's where the changes are all going to be.
Barry, you've shown us four different possible scenarios. The one scenario that I hear the most, that I have heard you dance around, because there are elements of it in various scenarios that you've painted for us, but you haven't really expressly referred to the one word that I hear more often than almost anything else with regard to the impact of these tariffs, and that is stagflation. That the economy will slow down and possibly stagnate and actually start shrinking, whereas inflation will pick up to a level that we haven't seen in many years. Do you have any thoughts with regard to either the likelihood of stagflation or what that might mean for people that are trying to navigate capital markets?
Okay, so let's talk about Canada, and then we'll talk about the United States. First of all, we've already seen in the very short tenure that new Prime Minister Carney has, that he said, which everyone had to know, that we're going to stop doing retaliation dollar for dollar, because it only makes it worse. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth makes everybody blind and toothless. But it doesn't help the Canadian economy in any way, because tariffs are taxes. We don't want more taxes. And why would we impose them as retaliation against the Americans when they could be far more strategic in how you want to go ahead? So my own sense is that from the Canadian point of view, we're going to get a lot more strategic in what we do. And we're probably going to force ahead. Like the USMCA, the USMCA had a term until 2036. But having an agreement that doesn't have any meaning is irrational. So for sure, we're going to be renegotiating it, but it's got to be renegotiated in a way that actually has some meaning. And that's the part, because we don't have any trust. The US isn't just about America first, it's about America only. And so you got to show your trading partners that they're going to get benefit, and it's got to be there. The other thing that we've seen from this is that Canada is just not a player in this game. We're the bargaining chips. And so I don't want to be in the game where I'm the chips. So you got to figure out, is that worthwhile? So the problem is tariffs are going to not be the answer for Canada. Some type of policy measures are going to be the measure. And Canada's going to have to compete for global capital, probably by way of tax policy changes, would be my sense. And that is going to trigger an inflationary effect by a reduction of tax. But that actually may be good rather than bad. That may change it, but we have to see where that goes. Let's go to the Americans. The Americans are going to force inflation with the tariff. The idea is that tariffs are not going to really impact money supply, and therefore it's going to be far less inflationary as possible. That's the theory. We don't really know. And then the idea is, that's why you have to look at five-alarm fire. If you get the currency change, then that changes the inflationary effect as well. Because a lower US dollar on this with more US substitution, more US supply, actually has a lower effect rather than a higher effect. So maybe they're crazy like foxes, or maybe they're pushing so many things and it all blows up. That's the part we don't know. And that's why VIX, the amount of volatility, is going through the roof. And that's really our big problem. So I'm not as worried about the policies for stagflation. I am worried about stagflation. I just see the policies probably working their way out much faster, because I believe that you're going to get a large number of bilateral agreements that are negotiated, where the U.S. gets extraordinary rents, or the word we use in economics, but the way I would call it are crown jewels and trophies. They're going to get all types of goodies from different countries to buy them off from having a trade war. And the problem they've had so far is they overplayed their hand with Canada and with Mexico. And so that actually got everybody going, their elbows up, right? That's how everything is back here at home. And so at the end of the day, I don't know what we're going to see, except we're going to see a lot of volatility. I tell everybody, fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a real bumpy ride. And then we'll have a better idea. But inflation, maybe. The problem's going to be, how long is it going to be? The question's going to be, what does our world look like 6 months from now? That's the question. But I don't have the answer.
Okay, good. I don't expect you to. And I think, in fact, I would be suspicious of anyone who claimed to have the answer. We've got to wrap this up, Barry. We're just running out of time. The podcast is called Make Better Wealth Decisions. And I've heard you talk repeatedly now about volatility and bumpy rides and expecting the unexpected. If there was any bit of nugget of information or advice that you would give to the listeners and viewers, what would you counsel them to think about or to do to help them make better wealth decisions?
The first thing is, I'm an optimist. I actually think we can do smart policies in Canada and find ways to make this work out better that will eventually be better for the whole country. All right. So a lot of people are shying away from news, and that makes bad decisions as well. Aversion to news is as a bad investing decision as much as anything else. Second thing is, I think that you can continue to make your investments, but small amounts over time rather than big bets at any one time, because volatility is definitely in the air and it's not going away. So I would start with both of those, but I'm not scared for Canada, even though we're in a fairly vulnerable position. It's a hockey game and you've got a couple of players in the penalty box. You just got to play your game smarter and better and hope you work the penalty out. That's what I think we're going to do. So elbows up and kill the penalty, and let's see how it all goes.
It's a great way to end. Barry, thank you so much for your time today. It's always a pleasure speaking to you, and I'm really appreciative of you being able to take time from your crazy busy schedule to share with us today.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me, and many thanks to your viewers.
This podcast is not to be construed as offering specific investment advice. Please consult a qualified advisor before acting. My books, Stand Up to the Financial Services Industry and Bullshift, are available online. If you'd like to meet to discuss how the topics in this podcast affect you directly, please visit my website.